The golden age of any empire is a fleeting, sun-drenched afternoon, destined to be followed by the long, encroaching shadows of evening. For the Ottoman Empire, this twilight began not on a battlefield, but in the silent, perfumed corridors of the Topkapi Palace. The very heart of Ottoman power, once a crucible of ambition and global strategy, slowly transformed into a gilded cage. After Suleiman the Magnificent, a lineage of sultans followed who were not forged in the crucible of war and governance, but were instead raised in the cloistered, decadent world of the harem. Suleiman himself, weary of the burdens of state in his later years, had begun the trend, withdrawing from public affairs to devote himself to leisure. His successors inherited the throne not as seasoned warriors or shrewd statesmen, but as prisoners of a system designed to protect them, a system that ultimately left them dangerously unprepared to rule. The brutal tradition of royal fratricide, the killing of brothers to prevent succession crises, was replaced by a seemingly more humane, but far more insidious practice, the confinement of potential heirs in the caves, or the cage, a section of the palace where they lived in splendid isolation, often for decades, with no training in the art of governance, no understanding of the vast world they were one day expected to command. From this isolation, a rot began to spread from the very top. Power, abhorring a vacuum, flowed away from the increasingly incompetent sultans and into the hands of others, the grand viziers, the harem factions led by the formidable queen mothers, and court eunuchs. Corruption and nepotism, once held in check by powerful rulers, now flourished. Positions of power were no longer earned through merit, but were bought and sold, breeding a culture of avarice and short-sightedness. This internal decay was mirrored in the very institution that had been the bedrock of Ottoman strength, the Janissaries. Once the most disciplined and feared soldiers in the world, the elite slave infantry of the Sultan, they began to see their position not as a duty, but as a privilege to be exploited. The strict rules that had defined them were relaxed. They were allowed to marry, to engage in trade, and their sons were permitted to enter the corps, transforming it from a merit-based force into a hereditary, entrenched interest group. This new generation of Janissaries was more interested in politics and profit than in military innovation. They became kingmakers and palace wreckers, a powerful political faction that could hold the Sultan himself hostage. They would riot for more pay, assassinate officials who threatened their privileges, and most disastrously for the empire, they became a deeply reactionary force, fiercely resisting any attempt at military reform. While Europe was undergoing a military revolution, forging new tactics and developing ever more lethal firearms, the Janissaries clung to their outdated methods and weapons, viewing any change as a threat to their dominance. The very corps that had conquered Constantinople with advanced artillery now stood as a formidable barrier to progress. The empire's military might, once its sharpest sword, began to dull. The once unbeatable Ottoman army found itself increasingly outmatched by the better drilled, better equipped, and more adaptable armies of its European rivals. This creeping paralysis culminated in a moment of profound symbolic failure. In 1683, the Ottoman army stood once again before the gates of Vienna, the city that had haunted their ambitions for a century and a half. But this was not the unstoppable force of Suleiman's time. It was a vast, but increasingly unwieldy and technologically lagging army, led by a grand vizier of great ambition but questionable strategy. The failed siege was a disaster, a shattering blow not just to Ottoman military prestige, but to its very psyche. It marked a decisive turning point, the moment when the tide of expansion that had carried the empire forward for 3 centuries finally and irrevocably broke. For the first time, the great powers of Europe saw the giant not as an existential threat, but as a wounded beast. A coalition of European powers, the Holy League, was formed, and for the first time, they went on a coordinated offensive, attacking the empire on multiple fronts. The defeat at Vienna opened the floodgates, leading to a string of devastating military losses and the ceding of vast territories, most notably Hungary in the Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699. The empire was now on the defensive, a profound and shocking reversal of its historical role. This military stagnation was intertwined with a deepening economic malaise. The discovery of new sea routes to Asia by European powers like the British and the Dutch allowed them to bypass the Ottoman-controlled land routes, choking off a vital source of revenue. An influx of silver from the Americas into Europe caused rampant inflation, destabilizing the Ottoman economy. The government, deprived of conquest revenues and struggling with declining trade, resorted to debasing its coinage and imposing crushing taxes, which in turn fueled social unrest. The intricate machinery of the Ottoman state, once a marvel of efficiency, was grinding to a halt, corroded by internal corruption, military obsolescence, and economic turmoil. The sick man of Europe, as it would later be called, was beginning to show the first clear symptoms of a long and painful illness. It was a sickness born not from external wounds, but from a decay that had taken root within its own heart. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 was more than a mere document of surrender. It was a mirror held up to the Ottoman soul, and the reflection it showed was terrifying. For the first time in its history, the empire, the Ghazi state built on the sacred principle of continuous expansion, was forced to cede vast, long-held European territories. The psychological shockwave was immense, rippling from the marbled halls of the palace to the dusty coffeehouses of Istanbul. A profound and unsettling question began to hang in the air, whispered at first, then spoken with growing urgency. How had this happened? How had the divinely favored empire of the Sultan been so thoroughly humbled by the infidels? The answer was not to be found simply on the battlefields of Hungary, but in the quiet libraries, workshops, and observatories where a different kind of war was being waged, a war of ideas, of science, of knowledge. And in this war, the empire was falling desperately behind. While Europe was being reborn in the fires of the Renaissance and remade by the relentless logic of the Enlightenment, the Ottoman world seemed to have turned inward, content to gaze upon the glories of its own past. This intellectual stagnation found its most potent symbol in the story of a single, world-altering invention, the printing press. When Johannes Gutenberg perfected his movable type press in the mid-15th century, he didn't just invent a machine. He unleashed a hurricane of information that would flatten old hierarchies and build new worlds of thought. In Europe, books, pamphlets, and scientific treatises began to pour from the presses, spreading new ideas with a speed and reach that was previously unimaginable. But in the Ottoman Empire, the reception of this revolutionary technology was muted, hesitant, and deeply suspicious. For nearly 3 centuries, the press was effectively rejected. This was not a simple failure of vision. It was a conscious choice rooted in the very fabric of Ottoman culture. The art of calligraphy was a revered and sacred practice, especially in the transcription of the Koran. To replace the devoted hand of the scribe with the cold, impersonal mechanism of a machine was seen by many religious scholars as a profanation. Furthermore, the scribal guilds were a powerful and entrenched lobby, a vast network of artisans whose entire livelihood was threatened by this new technology. They represented tradition, beauty, and the human touch in a world of letters, and they resisted the tide of change with all their might. It wasn't until 1727, a staggering 273 years after Gutenberg's Bible, that the first Turkish-language printing press was officially established in Istanbul by Ibrahim Mutafarrika. And even then, it operated under severe restrictions. By a decree of the Sultan, it was forbidden from printing any religious texts. It was a compromise, a tentative step into a new world, but it was too little, too late. By that time, Europe had been flooded with millions of books, fueling revolutions in science, philosophy, and politics. The lack of a vibrant print culture meant that the transformative ideas of the European Enlightenment, the works of Newton, Locke, Voltaire, penetrated the Ottoman world only slowly, trickling in through a handful of ambassadors and scholars rather than flowing to the wider educated public. This information deficit created an ever-widening chasm. While European universities were debating radical new theories about the nature of the universe and the rights of man, Ottoman madrasas continued to focus on a curriculum that had remained largely unchanged for centuries, centered on theology and jurisprudence. Science, which had once flourished under Islamic civilization, was now seen as a secondary pursuit, and its spirit of open inquiry was often stifled by a rigid adherence to dogma. This intellectual chasm had devastating practical consequences. The military defeats that so shocked the Ottoman leadership were not merely failures of strategy or courage. They were failures of technology and science. The new European armies they faced were not just better drilled. They were armed with superior metallurgy that produced lighter, more durable cannons. They used more refined gunpowder based on advanced chemistry, and their fortifications were designed with a sophisticated understanding of geometry and physics to better withstand artillery bombardment. Naval warfare, too, was being transformed by new ship designs, and crucially, by the science of navigation of chronometers and celestial mapping, which allowed fleets to operate with greater precision and range. The Ottoman Empire, which had once been a master of military engineering, was now being outthought and outbuilt. Its failure to embrace the printing press was a symptom of a much larger disease, a loss of the intellectual curiosity and syncretic dynamism that had characterized its golden age. It was a culture that had begun to prize preservation over innovation, and in a world that was accelerating at a dizzying pace, to stand still was to be left behind. The empire's worldview was becoming a closed circle, a fortress built to defend a glorious past, but one whose walls were now preventing it from seeing the new dawn breaking over the horizon. The humbling at Karlowitz was the first painful crack in those walls, revealing a chilling vulnerability. It became clear that the threat was not just the military power of its enemies, but their very way of thinking, their system of knowledge that was generating this power. The old confidence, the serene assurance of superiority, was beginning to erode, replaced by annoying anxiety. The empire had faced enemies before, but now it faced a different kind of challenge, one that could not be met with scimitars and cannons alone. It was a challenge that required a new kind of weapon, the weapon of the mind, and the long, arduous, and often painful process of trying to acquire this weapon, of attempting to modernize without losing its soul, would come to define the final centuries of the Ottoman story. The sickness that had begun in the palace was now being compounded by a blindness to the changing world outside, a blindness that would make the empire dangerously susceptible to a new, more insidious form of conquest. Continue script from here. The conquest of an empire does not always arrive with the thunder of cannons and the clash of steel. Sometimes it seeps in, silently, like a rising tide, not through shattered city walls, but through bustling ports and crowded marketplaces. It comes disguised as commerce, cloaked in the language of treaties and trade. While the Ottoman elite wrestled with the shock of their military and intellectual decline, a new and perhaps even more corrosive force was at work, eating away at the very economic foundations of their state. The weapon of this new conquest was not the musket, but the ledger book. Its soldiers were not janissaries, but merchants and bankers from a Europe that was rapidly mastering the machinery of industrial capitalism. And the key that unlocked the gates of the empire for this insidious invasion was a set of agreements known, with a deep and tragic irony, as the capitulations. In their origin, they were not a mark of weakness, but a gesture of supreme confidence. When Suleiman the Magnificent first granted these trading privileges to the French in the 16th century, it was an act of a mighty ruler bestowing favors upon a lesser power, a way to foster beneficial trade on his own terms. But the world had changed. The empire was no longer mighty. By the 18th and 19th centuries, these capitulations had transformed from voluntary concessions into instruments of economic domination, their terms expanded and enforced by the ever-present threat of European gunboats. They became a legal framework for exploitation. Under these treaties, European merchants operating within the Ottoman Empire were granted a status that was almost supernatural. They were exempt from most local taxes. They were immune from prosecution in Ottoman courts, instead being subject only to the laws of their own country, administered by their own consuls. They effectively lived and worked within the empire, but were not of it, a privileged class that could operate with impunity, draining wealth from the local economy without contributing to it. This created a state within a state, a shadow economy that the Sultan's government was powerless to control. The consequences of this system were catastrophic, a slow-motion strangulation of the Ottoman economy from the inside out. The vibrant bazaars of cities like Bursa and Aleppo, once the heart of a thriving artisanal economy, were slowly poisoned. How could a local textile weaver, who paid taxes to his government, fees to his guild, and tribute to his city, possibly compete with a British merchant importing cheap, mass-produced cloth from the factories of Manchester, a merchant who paid virtually no taxes at all? He couldn't. One by one, the looms fell silent. The craft guilds, the bedrock of Ottoman urban society for centuries, withered and collapsed, unable to protect their members from this flood of foreign competition. The empire that had once sat astride the world's most lucrative trade routes, controlling the flow of silk and spices, now found itself being turned into a captive market for European manufactured goods and a mere exporter of raw materials. Its economic sovereignty was being dismantled, piece by piece. The government, unable to levy tariffs to protect its infant industries, and deprived of tax revenue from the most profitable sector of its economy, found its treasury emptying at an alarming rate. To fill the ever-widening gap, the sultans did what so many desperate rulers have done throughout history. They began to borrow. The loans came from the very same European powers whose merchants were crippling the empire's economy. It was a vicious, inescapable cycle. The initial loans were followed by more, each with more punishing terms, leading the empire into a downward spiral of debt from which it could not escape. The situation became so dire that in 1881, the Ottoman government was forced to accept the establishment of the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This was the ultimate humiliation, a final surrender of economic independence. This new body was run not by Ottoman officials, but by the European creditors themselves. It was granted control over the most lucrative sources of state revenue, the salt and tobacco monopolies, the stamp duties, the tributes from vassal states, all to ensure that the European bankers would get their money back. The Ottoman Empire was now, in effect, in receivership. Its finances were being managed by the very powers that held it in bondage. The spectacle was a painful one to behold. While the Sultan still sat on his throne in Istanbul, surrounded by the outward trappings of power, the real economic lifeblood of his empire was being siphoned off by foreign interests. The ships that crowded the Golden Horn now flew the flags of Britain, France, and Russia, laden not with the tribute of conquered lands, but with the profits extracted from an economy that was no longer its own. The sickness of the sick man of Europe was not just military or intellectual. It was a deep, systemic infection of its economic marrow. This profound weakness, this inability to provide prosperity or even protection for its own subjects, created a fertile ground for dissent and despair. As the central state weakened, as its legitimacy frayed, the many different peoples who lived under the Ottoman flag began to look not to the Sultan for their salvation, but to a new and explosive idea that was beginning to sweep across the continent from the west, the idea of the nation. An idea is a more dangerous invader than any army. It requires no ships, no siege engines, no supply lines. It travels silently on the lips of merchants, in the pages of forbidden books, and in the quiet prayers of the oppressed. And in the 19th century, the most powerful and revolutionary idea in the world was nationalism. For the Ottoman Empire, a sprawling, multi-ethnic tapestry woven from 100 different threads of language, religion, and culture, this idea was not just a threat. It was a death sentence. To understand the devastating impact of this new creed, one must first understand the very nature of the Ottoman world. It was not a nation-state in the modern sense. A Greek merchant in Smyrna, an Armenian artisan in Van, a Serbian farmer in the hills of Bosnia, and an Arab scholar in Damascus did not think of themselves as a minority living in a Turkish empire. They were all Osmanli, subjects of the Padishah, the Sultan Caliph. Their primary identity was defined not by their ethnicity, but by their religion. For centuries, this diversity was managed by a unique and remarkably stable structure known as the millet system. Each major religious group, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Christians, the Jews, formed a self-governing community, a millet responsible for its own internal affairs, its schools, its churches, its family law. The Sultan was the ultimate authority, the protector of all faiths. But he did not seek to impose a single culture or language upon his diverse peoples. Loyalty was to the dynasty, the House of Osman, and to the divinely ordained social order it represented. It was a system that had worked for half a millennium, a testament to a kind of imperial pluralism that was unknown in the religiously monolithic kingdoms of Europe. But from a continent away, in the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary Paris, a new gospel was being preached, a gospel that would shatter this old world. It declared that political legitimacy came not from God or from a dynastic bloodline, but from the people, and that these people, a nation, were bound together by a common language, culture, and destiny. And most dangerously of all, it proclaimed that every nation had the sacred right to its own state. This idea, carried eastward by the Napoleonic Wars and the expanding networks of trade and diplomacy, was like a spark falling on the dry tinder of the Balkans. It found fertile ground among the Christian populations of the empire's European provinces, who began to see themselves not as Orthodox subjects of the Sultan, but as Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, nations in bondage, yearning to be free. The great powers of Europe, sensing a profound weakness in their old rival, became the eager midwives of these nascent nationalisms. Russia, the great bear to the north, styled itself as the holy protector of its Orthodox Slavic brethren, funding Serbian rebels and Bulgarian intellectuals. France claimed a similar patronage over the Catholics, while Britain postured as a defender of various minorities, all using the language of liberation to mask the cold, hard calculus of geopolitical ambition. They sought to dismember the sick man of Europe for their own gain, and nationalism was the perfect scalpel for the task. The first deep cut came in Serbia, with an uprising in 1804 that, after years of brutal fighting, carved out a small, autonomous principality. But it was the Greek War of Independence, erupting in 1821, that truly set the empire ablaze. This was not just another provincial revolt. It became a cause célèbre across Europe. Romantic poets like Lord Byron died for the cause, and the great powers, after years of dithering, finally intervened, their fleets shattering the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. The birth of an independent Greek kingdom was a thunderclap, a stunning demonstration that the ancient imperial structure could be broken. It proved to the other subject peoples that independence was not a madman's dream, but an achievable reality. The genie of nationalism was out of the bottle, and it could not be forced back in. Throughout the 19th century, the Balkans became a cauldron of insurrection, a relentless drain on the empire's already dwindling resources of money and manpower. A seemingly endless series of uprisings, wars, and nationalist conspiracies erupted in Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Macedonia. The very millet system that had preserved the peace for so long now acted as an incubator for these movements. having preserved the distinct languages, religions, and cultural institutions that formed the basis of these new national identities. The Ottoman Empire was now fighting a war not just on its borders, but in the hearts and minds of its own people. The old bonds of loyalty were dissolving, replaced by new, passionate allegiances to flags that had not yet been designed and nations that were still being imagined. The empire, which had always seen itself as a unified house of Islam and a protector of its non-Muslim subjects, was now being recast by its enemies and by its own rebellious peoples as a Turkish yoke, an alien prison of nations. This internal hemorrhaging was as debilitating as any foreign invasion. It turned neighbor against neighbor, unleashed waves of horrific ethnic violence, and created a permanent crisis in the empire's most strategically vital region. The Balkan question would dominate European diplomacy for a century, a constant source of instability that the empire was utterly powerless to solve. A desperate, frantic search began within the corridors of Istanbul for a cure, a new political formula that could somehow hold the fracturing state together before it shattered into a dozen warring pieces. The age of empire was dying, and the age of nations was being born in blood and fire. An idea is a more dangerous invader than any army. It requires no ships, no siege engines, no supply lines. It travels silently on the lips of merchants, in the pages of forbidden books, and in the quiet prayers of the oppressed. And in the 19th century, the most powerful and revolutionary idea in the world was nationalism. For the Ottoman Empire, a sprawling, multi-ethnic tapestry woven from 100 different threads of language, religion, and culture, this idea was not just a threat. It was a death sentence. To understand the devastating impact of this new creed, one must first understand the very nature of the Ottoman world. It was not a nation-state in the modern sense. A Greek merchant in Smyrna, an Armenian artisan in Van, a Serbian farmer in the hills of Bosnia, and an Arab scholar in Damascus did not think of themselves as a minority living in a Turkish empire. They were all Osmanli, subjects of the Padishah, the Sultan Caliph. Their primary identity was defined not by their ethnicity, but by their religion. For centuries, this diversity was managed by a unique and remarkably stable structure known as the millet system. Each major religious group, the Greek Orthodox, the Armenian Christians, the Jews, formed a self-governing community, a millet responsible for its own internal affairs, its schools, its churches, its family law. The Sultan was the ultimate authority, the protector of all faiths. But he did not seek to impose a single culture or language upon his diverse peoples. Loyalty was to the dynasty, the House of Osman, and to the divinely ordained social order it represented. It was a system that had worked for half a millennium, a testament to a kind of imperial pluralism that was unknown in the religiously monolithic kingdoms of Europe. But from a continent away, in the blood-soaked streets of revolutionary Paris, a new gospel was being preached, a gospel that would shatter this old world. It declared that political legitimacy came not from God or from a dynastic bloodline, but from the people, and that these people, a nation, were bound together by a common language, culture, and destiny. And most dangerously of all, it proclaimed that every nation had the sacred right to its own state. This idea, carried eastward by the Napoleonic Wars and the expanding networks of trade and diplomacy, was like a spark falling on the dry tinder of the Balkans. It found fertile ground among the Christian populations of the empire's European provinces, who began to see themselves not as Orthodox subjects of the Sultan, but as Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, nations in bondage, yearning to be free. The great powers of Europe, sensing a profound weakness in their old rival, became the eager midwives of these nascent nationalisms. Russia, the great bear to the north, styled itself as the holy protector of its Orthodox Slavic brethren, funding Serbian rebels and Bulgarian intellectuals. France claimed a similar patronage over the Catholics, while Britain postured as a defender of various minorities, all using the language of liberation to mask the cold, hard calculus of geopolitical ambition. They sought to dismember the sick man of Europe for their own gain, and nationalism was the perfect scalpel for the task. The first deep cut came in Serbia, with an uprising in 1804 that, after years of brutal fighting, carved out a small, autonomous principality. But it was the Greek War of Independence, erupting in 1821, that truly set the empire ablaze. This was not just another provincial revolt. It became a cause célèbre across Europe. Romantic poets like Lord Byron died for the cause. And the great powers, after years of dithering, finally intervened, their fleets shattering the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Navarino in 1827. The birth of an independent Greek kingdom was a thunderclap, a stunning demonstration that the ancient imperial structure could be broken. It proved to the other subject peoples that independence was not a madman's dream, but an achievable reality. The genie of nationalism was out of the bottle, and it could not be forced back in. Throughout the 19th century, the Balkans became a cauldron of insurrection, a relentless drain on the empire's already dwindling resources of money and manpower. A seemingly endless series of uprisings, wars, and nationalist conspiracies erupted in Romania, Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Macedonia. The very millet system that had preserved the peace for so long now acted as an incubator for these movements, having preserved the distinct languages, religions, and cultural institutions that formed the basis of these new national identities. The Ottoman Empire was now fighting a war not just on its borders, but in the hearts and minds of its own people. The old bonds of loyalty were dissolving, replaced by new, passionate allegiances to flags that had not yet been designed and nations that were still being imagined. The empire, which had always seen itself as a unified house of Islam and a protector of its non-Muslim subjects, was now being recast by its enemies and by its own rebellious peoples as a Turkish yoke, an alien prison of nations. This internal hemorrhaging was as debilitating as any foreign invasion. It turned neighbor against neighbor, unleashed waves of horrific ethnic violence, and created a permanent crisis in the empire's most strategically vital region. The Balkan question would dominate European diplomacy for a century, a constant source of instability that the empire was utterly powerless to solve. A desperate, frantic search began within the corridors of Istanbul for a cure, a new political formula that could somehow hold the fracturing state together before it shattered into a dozen warring pieces. The age of empire was dying, and the age of nations was being born in blood and fire. The dream of a shared homeland, a brotherhood of Ottomans, died not in the grand debating chambers of the new government, but in the fire-scorched villages of the Balkans and the cold, cynical drawing rooms of European embassies. The Tanzimat reforms, for all their noble intentions, had failed to mend the fractured soul of the empire. The ideology of Ottomanism was a beautiful, fragile vessel, shattered against the hard rocks of ethnic nationalism and imperial ambition. And into the chaos and disillusionment that followed this failure stepped a new kind of sultan, a man who saw the liberal experiment not as a solution, but as the very source of the empire's weakness. His name was Abdülhamid II, and he would rule as the last of the great autocrats, a dark, complex figure who would hold the crumbling empire together for 3 decades through a formidable combination of piety, paranoia, and ruthless political will. He was a shadow cast by the setting sun of his dynasty, a ruler for a darker, more desperate age. Abdülhamid ascended to the throne in 1876, a year of almost unimaginable crisis. The empire was bankrupt. A catastrophic series of uprisings had engulfed the Balkans, and the great powers of Europe were circling like vultures, drawing up plans for the final dismemberment of the sick man. In a desperate bid to win Western support and placate the reform-minded elites within his own government, Abdülhamid did the unthinkable. He promulgated the first-ever Ottoman constitution. For a fleeting moment, the empire was a constitutional monarchy, with an elected parliament and the promise of a new era of liberty. But Abdul Hamid was playing a long game. He viewed the Constitution and its liberal champions as naive fools, men who failed to understand that the empire was in a fight for its very survival, a fight that could not be won with parliamentary debates and lofty proclamations of universal rights. He was merely biding his time, waiting for the inevitable pretext to reclaim the absolute power he believed was his by divine right. That pretext arrived with devastating speed. In 1877, Russia, citing its role as the protector of the Orthodox Christians, declared war. The conflict was a cataclysm. The newly modernized Ottoman army fought with desperate bravery, but it was ultimately no match for the Russian juggernaut. Russian armies swept through the Balkans, reaching the very gates of Istanbul. The empire was brought to its knees, forced to sign a humiliating peace treaty that stripped it of vast territories and confirmed the independence of Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro. For Abdul Hamid, this disaster was the ultimate proof of the failure of the liberal path. Using the war as his justification, he suspended the constitution, dissolved the parliament, and sent its leading architects into exile. The brief, hopeful spring of Ottoman constitutionalism was over, replaced by a long, cold winter of autocracy. For the next 30 years, Abdul Hamid would rule from the secluded splendor of the Yildiz Palace, a virtual fortress from which he would attempt to remake the empire in his own image. If Ottomanism had failed, a new glue was needed to hold the remaining pieces of the empire together. With the Christian Balkans now largely lost, Abdul Hamid turned to the one identity that the majority of his remaining subjects, Arabs, Kurds, Albanians, Bosnians, and Turks, still shared: their Islamic faith. He discarded the secularism of the Tanzimat and instead championed the new, potent ideology of pan-Islamism. He heavily promoted his own position as caliph, not just the Sultan of the Ottomans, but the spiritual leader of the entire global community of Muslims. He poured money into building mosques, religious schools, and Sufi lodges across the empire. He sent emissaries to Muslims in India, Africa, and Central Asia, calling for unity under his banner. His most ambitious project was the Hejaz Railway, a line built with donations from Muslims around the world to connect Damascus to the holy city of Medina, making the pilgrimage, the Hajj, easier for the faithful. It was a masterful piece of political theater, a way to recenter the empire around its Islamic core and project an image of power and piety that could, he hoped, galvanize the loyalty of his diverse Muslim populations and push back against the corrosive influence of Western ideas. To enforce this new order, Abdul Hamid constructed one of the most sophisticated and feared systems of internal control the empire had ever seen. He was the Red Sultan, not just for the massacres that would stain his reign, but for the blood-red ink of his censors' pens. The press was muzzled, theaters were monitored, and a vast network of spies and informants was established, reporting directly to the palace. Paranoia became an instrument of state policy. No one knew who was listening. An atmosphere of fear and suspicion descended upon the capital, silencing dissent and crushing any hint of political opposition. Yet, paradoxically, this arch-conservative was also a committed modernizer. He continued many of the technical and educational reforms of the Tanzimat, but stripped them of their liberal political content. He expanded the telegraph network, built roads and railways, and opened thousands of modern professional schools for engineering, medicine, and public administration. He understood that the empire needed modern technology and educated officials to survive. He wanted a state with a European brain, but an Islamic heart and an autocratic will. He wanted the weapons of the West, without the ideas that came with them. But this was a dangerous and ultimately self-defeating contradiction. In silencing the liberals of the older generation, he was inadvertently creating a new and far more radical opposition, forged in the very modern schools he had built, and in promoting a powerful Islamic identity to counter Christian nationalism He was awakening a force that would soon be mirrored by a new, exclusive, and aggressive nationalism among his own Turkish subjects. There is a profound and terrible irony that haunts the final years of every autocrat. In their obsessive quest for control, they often forge the very instruments of their own destruction. They build roads, and rebels use them to march. They erect telegraph poles, and revolutionaries use them to coordinate. But their most fatal error is in the schools they build. They seek to train a new generation of loyal servants, of obedient engineers and disciplined officers. But they cannot stop the unintended consequence. They create men who can read, who can think, who can look upon the world, and see not just what is, but what could be. This was the fatal paradox of Sultan Abdülhamid II. From his gilded cage in the Yildiz Palace, he had meticulously constructed a modern state apparatus, but in doing so, he had accidentally created a new kind of man, the young Turk, and in their hearts, a fire was kindled that would burn his old world to the ground. These were not the old liberal pashas of the Tanzimat era. They were a new breed, forged not in the salons of Istanbul, but in the sterile lecture halls of the new military and medical academies. They were young, they were impatient, and they were patriots in a way the empire had never seen before. They read not only their military textbooks, but also the forbidden works of French and German sociologists and philosophers. They saw an empire plagued by corruption, crippled by foreign debt, and mocked by the great powers. They saw Abdülhamid's paranoid, spy-ridden autocracy and his promotion of pan-Islamism not as a source of strength, but as the final, desperate gasps of a dying order. Their diagnosis was simple. The sickness was the Sultan himself, and the cure was the restoration of the one thing he feared most, the 1876 Constitution. To them, the Constitution was more than a document. It was a sacred text, a symbol of modernity, of reason, of a future where science, not superstition, would guide the state. Their conspiracy took root in the shadows, in secret societies with coded names and clandestine meetings. The most formidable of these was the Committee of Union and Progress, CUP, which began as a network of exiled intellectuals in Paris and Geneva, but soon found its true power base where Abdülhamid's control was weakest and the empire's decay was most visible, among the army officers stationed in the cauldron of Macedonia. Here, in the empire's last major European province, the Ottoman state was in a state of near constant collapse. It was a bewildering landscape of competing nationalist guerrilla bands, Bulgarian, Greek, Serbian, and a demoralized Ottoman army, sent to fight an unwinnable war against an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. It was in the barracks of cities like Salonika that the officers of the Third Army, men like the charismatic Enver Bey, formed the revolutionary cells that would shake the empire to its core. They were men of action, tired of the endless debates of the Parisian exiles. They believed that only the army, the one institution that had been truly modernized, could save the state from itself. The moment came in the summer of 1908. It was not a mass uprising, but a swift and decisive military mutiny. Enver Bey and his fellow officers led their troops from the barracks, issuing an ultimatum to the Sultan from the hills of Macedonia: restore the constitution, or we will march on Istanbul. The message flew across the very telegraph wires that Abdülhamid had used to control his empire. It was the modern state turning on its creator. The Sultan, a master of political survival, found himself completely outmaneuvered. His spies had failed him, and more importantly, he discovered that the other army units he might have called upon were unwilling to fire on their revolutionary brethren. The loyalty he had so carefully cultivated had evaporated. Cornered and isolated, he yielded. On July 24, 1908, an imperial decree announced that the Constitution of 1876 was once again the law of the land. A tidal wave of euphoria swept from the Balkans to the Arabian desert. In cities across the land, a spectacle unfolded that would have been unimaginable just days before. Turks and Greeks, Armenians and Jews, Muslims and Christians, poured into the streets, waving the Ottoman flag, embracing one another as long-lost brothers. It seemed for a brief, miraculous moment that the dream of Ottomanism was not dead after all. It had simply been sleeping, waiting for this moment of liberation to be reawakened. Political prisoners were freed. The Sultan's spies vanished from the streets, and a torrent of new newspapers and political clubs bloomed overnight. The air was thick with the promise of a new dawn, a future of liberty, equality, and fraternity for all peoples of the empire. But a revolution is an earthquake. It may topple the rotting old structures, but it also awakens the sleeping monsters that lie beneath the surface. The Young Turks were united in their hatred of the old regime, but they were a coalition of wildly different factions: liberal constitutionalists, secular positivists, and most ominously, a core of ardent Turkish nationalists. They had successfully overthrown a tyrant, but they had no clear plan for what to build in his place. And as the initial joy faded, the deep, intractable problems of the empire remained, now complicated by a power vacuum and the dangerous, competing ambitions of the men who called themselves its saviors. The heady wine of revolution soon gives way to the bitter taste of reality. A constitution, however sacred, cannot pay an empty treasury. A parliament, however eloquent, cannot command the loyalty of a fractured people overnight. The Young Turks, the saviors of the state, now found themselves its masters, and they discovered that it is infinitely easier to tear down a prison than it is to build a nation in its place. The problems that had plagued Abdülhamid did not vanish with him. They were now laid bare in the harsh, unforgiving light of day. The national debt was a mountain. The great powers were as predatory as ever, and in the far-flung provinces, from the mountains of Albania to the deserts of Yemen, the old centrifugal forces of tribal and ethnic loyalty were pulling the empire apart. The new government was a chaotic coalition of idealists, soldiers, and scholars, men who knew how to conspire in secret, but had little experience in the messy, compromising art of governance. The ship of state was still sinking, and they had simply thrown the old captain overboard and seized a wheel they barely knew how to turn. Their naivete was shattered by the first violent tremor of the counter-revolution. In April 1909, less than a year after the glorious restoration of the Constitution, a reactionary mutiny erupted in Istanbul. Led by conservative religious students and disgruntled soldiers, and secretly encouraged by Abdülhamid's agents, mobs flooded the streets, demanding a return to Sharia law and the abolition of the new secular policies. For a terrifying few days, it seemed as if the revolution was about to be strangled in its cradle. But the Committee of Union and Progress had its power base not in the fickle politics of the capital, but in the disciplined loyalty of the army. From Salonika, the Action Army, a force of loyalist troops under the command of Mahmud Şevket Pasha, marched on Istanbul to crush the rebellion. The fighting was fierce, a brutal street-by-street battle for the soul of the empire. When the dust settled, the revolution had been saved, but it had been saved by the gun. A lesson was learned that day, a dark and cynical lesson that would poison the future, that ultimate power came not from the ballot box or the Constitution, but from the unwavering loyalty of soldiers. The counter-coup provided the perfect pretext for the cup to finish what they had started. Sultan Abdülhamid II was formally deposed and sent into exile, and his compliant brother, Mehmed V, was placed on the throne as a ceremonial figurehead. The Young Turks were now the undisputed, absolute masters of the Ottoman state. This baptism by fire irrevocably changed the character of the new regime. The fear of another betrayal, another uprising, snuffed out the last embers of their liberal idealism. The brief, chaotic experiment with multi-party democracy was over. The cup, once a secret society, now began to rule like one. They became a shadow government, a powerful clique operating behind the scenes, manipulating the parliament, assassinating political rivals, and purging the state of anyone deemed disloyal. The dream of liberty was replaced by a grim obsession with order and unity, imposed from the top down, by force if necessary. They had overthrown an autocrat only to create a new, more efficient, and more ideologically driven form of authoritarianism. The promise of a decentralized, pluralistic empire, a true brotherhood of peoples, was one of the first casualties of this new, harder-edged approach. The CUP's leaders were modernizers and centralizers. They saw the old autonomies of the various ethnic and religious groups not as a strength, but as a fatal weakness, a source of endless rebellion and foreign interference. Their solution was not to accommodate diversity, but to suppress it. And so they abandoned the now discredited ideology of Ottomanism and embraced a new, harder, and more dangerous idea, one that had been quietly growing in the minds of Turkish intellectuals for decades: Turkism. If the empire could not be Ottoman, then it would be Turkish. If the Christian subjects had abandoned the state for their own nationalisms, then the state would be refounded upon the identity of its core people, the Turks. This was a monumental and ultimately fatal shift. It was a decision to answer the exclusive nationalisms of the Serbs, Greeks, and Bulgarians with an exclusive nationalism of their own. Policies were enacted to promote the Turkish language in schools and administration across the empire, at the expense of Arabic, Albanian, and others. Economic power was to be shifted from the hands of the traditionally dominant Greek and Armenian minorities and into the hands of a new Turkish Muslim bourgeoisie. The state was no longer to be a neutral arbiter of a multi-ethnic society, but the active champion of a single, dominant ethnicity. This new policy of Turkification was a catastrophe. It was the final fatal poison injected into the already ailing body of the empire. The very peoples who had cheered the 1908 revolution as their own liberation, the Arabs, the Albanians, the Armenians now felt profoundly and utterly betrayed. They had traded the prison of an Islamic autocrat for the prison of a Turkish nation-state, a state in which they were now to be a permanent, subordinate minority. Their hopes for autonomy and cultural freedom were dashed. In response, their own nascent nationalist movements, which had once been small and marginal, now exploded with new vigor and popular support. Arab intellectuals began to dream not of a reformed Ottoman Empire, but of an independent Arab nation. Albanian chieftains once again took to the mountains in revolt. And among the Armenians, who had suffered so much under Abdülhamid and had placed so much faith in the revolution, this betrayal sowed the seeds of a deep and tragic bitterness that would soon bear the most horrific fruit. The young Turks, in their desperate quest for a modern, unified state, had succeeded only in atomizing it, turning every group against the center and against each other. The house was now not merely collapsing. It was at war with itself. And the vultures that had been circling for a century now saw their moment to dive. A body at war with itself sends an invitation to the wolves. The Ottoman Empire, having declared a civil war upon its own identity, having chosen the narrow path of Turkism over the broad, historic road of empire, was now wounded, bleeding, and surrounded. The predators had been circling for a century, patient and watchful, but now, smelling the unmistakable scent of decay, they began to close in. The first to strike was not one of the old great rivals, but a young kingdom with an old man's ambition, a nation desperate for its own place in the sun, Italy. In 1911, with the flimsiest of pretexts, Italy declared war and invaded the empire's last remaining territory in North Africa, the provinces of Tripolitania and Cyrenaica, the land that would one day be called Libya. It was a war that showcased, with brutal clarity, the new and terrible mechanics of modern warfare, against which the Ottomans were now hopelessly outmatched. Italian warships blockaded the coast, and Italian planes, the first ever to be used in a war for bombing and reconnaissance, droned over the desert sands, harbingers of a new age of anonymous mechanized slaughter. The Ottoman response was a study in impotence. The once mighty Ottoman navy, neglected and obsolete, dared not challenge the Italian fleet. The land route was blocked by British-controlled Egypt. The central government could do almost nothing to reinforce its besieged province. The defense of Libya was left to a handful of determined but isolated Ottoman officers, men who had to be smuggled across the border in disguise. Among them was a fiercely capable young officer with piercing blue eyes, a man named Mustafa Kemal, who successfully organized the local Arab and Berber tribes into a stubborn and effective guerrilla resistance. But courage alone could not hold back the tide of industrial power. The war dragged on, a painful, draining sore, a constant public humiliation. The empire could not win, but its pride would not let it surrender. It was a deadlock that was broken not in the deserts of Africa, but by a far more terrible storm that was gathering much closer to home. The spectacle of the great empire being held at bay by Italy sent a clear and electrifying message to the small, hungry kingdoms of the Balkans. If the sick man was too weak to defend his African lands, then surely he was too weak to defend his own backyard. The children of the empire, now grown into quarrelsome, ambitious kingdoms Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, saw their moment of destiny. In an astonishing feat of diplomacy, secretly encouraged by Russia, they put aside their bitter rivalries and forged a military alliance, the Balkan League. Their one shared sacred goal was the complete and final expulsion of the Ottoman Turk from Europe. In October of 1912, they attacked. It was not a war. It was a collapse, a landslide of men and steel. The Ottoman armies, which the Young Turks had so confidently believed they were modernizing, were shattered in a matter of weeks. They were poorly led, badly equipped, and most fatally, they were internally fractured by the CUP's own policies of Turkification, with Albanian and Arab soldiers deserting in droves. The retreat was a catastrophe on a scale the empire had not seen in its 600 years of life. It was a headlong, panicked flight. Entire armies dissolved into desperate, starving mobs, fleeing eastward towards the capital. Ancient Ottoman cities, the heartlands of the empire in Europe for half a millennium, fell one after another. Salonika, the vibrant port city that was the birthplace of the Young Turk Revolution itself, surrendered without a fight. In the west, the Albanians rose up and declared their independence. In the east, the Bulgarians smashed through the Ottoman lines, advancing to the very outskirts of Istanbul. For the first time since the days of Timur the Lame, the capital itself was under direct existential threat. The psychological shock was indescribable. This was not the orderly negotiated loss of a distant province, like Hungary 2 centuries before. This was the violent, chaotic amputation of the empire's European soul. The loss was accompanied by a human tragedy of biblical proportions. As hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees, the descendants of Turks who had lived in the Balkans for centuries, were driven from their homes, fleeing ahead of the advancing Christian armies in a desperate, freezing torrent of human misery. By the spring of 1913, the war was over. In a humiliating peace treaty signed in London, the Ottoman Empire surrendered all of its European territory, save for a tiny sliver of land around the capital. The great power that had once laid siege to Vienna was now reduced to a European foothold smaller than Switzerland. But the story had one final, violent, and deeply consequential twist. The victorious Balkan allies, having vanquished their common enemy, immediately fell upon each other, fighting ferociously over the spoils of their victory. As Bulgaria battled its former allies, Serbia and Greece, the most radical and daring faction within the cup in Istanbul, led by the charismatic and reckless Enver Pasha, saw a gambler's chance. Defying the weary caution of the older ministers, Enver launched a sudden, audacious counterattack. The Bulgarian forces, already engaged elsewhere, were taken completely by surprise. In a stunning reversal, Ottoman troops marched back into the historic city of Edirne, the empire's second capital, the resting place of its early sultans. The recapture of Edirne was a moment of pure, intoxicating triumph in a sea of unparalleled disaster. It did nothing to change the strategic catastrophe, but it was a massive propaganda victory. Enver Pasha was hailed as the hero of Edirne, a national savior. This one, small, defiant victory had a fateful effect. It cemented the power of the most extreme, nationalistic, and militaristic faction of the Young Turks. The disaster of the Balkan Wars had taught them a terrible lesson, that the world was a place of merciless struggle, where only the strong survived. And the fleeting glory of retaking Edirne had given them a dangerous, arrogant confidence in their own destiny. They were a military clique that had lost an empire, and now, burning with a desire for revenge and restoration, they began to look for a powerful new friend, a new ally who could help them rise from the ashes. A man on the edge of a cliff does not deliberate for long when a hand is offered, even if he cannot be certain of its intent. The Ottoman Empire, after the cataclysm of the Balkan Wars, was that man. Its government now firmly in the hands of a small, hardened cabal of military men who burned with a furious desire for vengeance. The world around them was a chessboard of giants, a continent arming itself for a final, apocalyptic confrontation. To remain neutral, to stand alone on that cliff edge, seemed like a slower, more certain form of suicide. An ally was not a luxury. It was a necessity for survival. But whose hand to take? The choice was a choice between poisons. On one side stood the powers of the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia. But these were not friends. They were the empire's oldest and most intimate enemies. They were the creditors who held the empire in a state of financial bondage. They were the imperial rivals who had spent a century nibbling away at its territories, from Egypt to Algeria. And among them was Russia, the great bear of the north. The ancient Orthodox nemesis whose sacred, centuries-old dream was to conquer Istanbul itself and plant a cross atop the Hagia Sophia. To ally with the Entente would be to entrust one's fate to the very wolves who had long licked their chops at the prospect of devouring the remains. But then there was another hand, reaching out from the heart of Europe, the German Empire. Here was a power of a different sort. Germany was a newcomer to the great game of empires, a nation of science, industry, and formidable military might, but one that carried none of the historical baggage of the others. Germany had never seized an Ottoman province. It had never funded a Balkan nationalist uprising against the Sultan. Instead, for decades, Germany had presented itself as a partner, a friend, an agent of modernization. German bankers were financing the most ambitious infrastructure project the empire had ever seen, the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, a steel artery designed to pump life and commerce back into the Ottoman heartland. And most crucially, the German military had become the model for the Ottoman army itself. Generations of German officers, from the great Helmuth von Moltke onward, had come to Istanbul to train and reorganize the Sultan's forces. This long and intimate military relationship had created a powerful pro-German faction deep within the Ottoman officer corps, and its most ardent champion was now the most powerful man in the empire, Enver Pasha. He and his fellow radicals in the cup saw in Germany a mirror image of their own ambitions, a young, dynamic, militaristic state unburdened by a decadent liberal past, ready to challenge the old, complacent empires of Britain and France. They saw an alliance not as a submission, but as a partnership of eagles that would allow the empire to soar once more. In the summer of 1914, the world caught fire. An assassin's bullet in the obscure Balkan city of Sarajevo triggered a fatal cascade of alliances, and within weeks, the great powers of Europe were marching to war. For the Ottoman government, the moment of decision had arrived. While the majority of the cabinet urged a careful policy of neutrality, a waiting game to see which side would prevail, Enver Pasha and his inner circle were already moving in the shadows. They believed this war was a gift from destiny. A German victory, they gambled, would mean the end of Russian ambitions, the restoration of the lost Balkan provinces, the cancellation of the crippling foreign debts, and the dawn of a new glorious age for a revitalized Turkish Empire. And so, on August 2nd, 1914, with the ink on Germany's declarations of war still wet, Enver Pasha and a handful of his co-conspirators signed a secret treaty of alliance with the German Empire. The decision was made without the knowledge of the Sultan, without the consent of the parliament, without even the approval of the majority of the Grand Vizier's cabinet. The fate of 60 million people was sealed in a secret room by a handful of men, betting their entire world on a roll of the dice in a war they did not fully understand. The final act that dragged the empire from a secret alliance into an open war was a masterpiece of geopolitical theater, a high-stakes naval drama played out on the waters of the Mediterranean. Two of Germany's most modern warships, the battle cruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau, found themselves trapped as war broke out, hunted by a superior British fleet. In a daring feat of seamanship, they evaded their pursuers and made a desperate dash for the Dardanelles, the strategic straits that led to Istanbul. According to international law, the neutral Ottomans were required to deny them entry. But Enver Pasha, bound by his secret treaty, saw his chance. He gave the order to let them pass. The German ships steamed into the Sea of Marmara and dropped anchor before the astonished eyes of the capital. It was a stunning provocation to the Entente. To preserve the thinnest veneer of neutrality, a charade was concocted. The Ottoman government announced that it had purchased the two ships from Germany. They were renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midilli. The Ottoman flag was hoisted up their masts, and their German crews simply swapped their caps for the Ottoman fez. It was a fiction that fooled no one. The empire was now harboring a German fleet in its own capital. The point of no return came 2 months later. In late October 1914, the German Admiral Wilhelm Souchon, who still commanded the ships and their German crews, sailed the newly Ottoman fleet into the Black Sea, under secret orders from Enver Pasha alone. What followed was a deliberate, calculated act of aggression designed to make war inevitable. The fleet bombarded the Russian ports of Sevastopol, Odessa, and Novorossiysk, sinking Russian ships and killing Russian citizens. When the news reached the capitals of Europe, the die was cast. Russia declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Britain and France, its allies, soon followed. The Ottoman Empire, led by the secret gamble of a few ambitious men, had entered the inferno. It had tied its fate to the war machine of the Central Powers, seeking rejuvenation, revenge, and rebirth. But the Great War would not be a war of restoration. It would be a funeral pyre, an all-consuming fire that would burn away the last vestiges of the ancient, multi-ethnic imperial order and forge in its terrible heat the violent birth of the modern Middle East. The Great War was not the swift, heroic surgery the Young Turks had imagined, a single glorious cut to remove the cancer of a century of humiliation. It was a slow, agonizing amputation performed without anesthetic, a multi-front nightmare that would demand from the empire's people the last full measure of their blood and endurance. On the icy peaks of the Caucasus, Enver Pasha, in a fit of delusional ambition, led the Third Army to its doom in the Battle of Sarikamish, where an entire generation of soldiers froze to death in the snows, a sacrifice to vanity and incompetence. In the deserts of Mesopotamia, British Indian forces pushed up the Tigris, and while Ottoman troops would achieve a stunning, temporary victory by capturing an entire British army at the Siege of Kut, it was a triumph that could not reverse the inexorable tide. In the Hejaz, the Arab revolt, fanned by British gold and the promises of a charismatic intelligence officer named T.E. Lawrence, tore the Arab provinces away from the empire for good, shattering Abdul Hamid's dream of pan-Islamic unity on the rocks of Arab nationalism. The Caliph had called for a global jihad, But his Arab subjects had instead chosen to fight alongside the Christian powers against him. It was the ultimate, bitter refutation of the empire's last great idea. Amidst this desperate existential struggle for survival, the paranoid nationalism of the Cup leadership curdled into a genocidal rage. They looked at the large Armenian Christian population living in the strategic eastern provinces, bordering their mortal enemy Russia, and they saw not fellow citizens, but a potential fifth column, a fatal internal threat to their vision of a homogeneous Turkish state. The dream of a pure nation required the nightmare of erasing those who did not fit. In 1915, the Ottoman government embarked upon one of the darkest chapters of the 20th century. Under the cover of war, Armenian intellectuals and leaders were rounded up and executed. Then, the orders came down for the forced deportation of the entire Armenian population from their ancestral lands. It was a death march. Driven from their homes at bayonet point, hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were forced into the Syrian desert to starve, to die of thirst and disease, or to be murdered by government-sponsored militias. It was the brutal, horrific, and logical endpoint of the Young Turk ideology. When the brotherhood of man fails, the only thing left is the purification of the tribe. Yet even in its death throes, the old empire could still summon moments of astonishing, heroic defiance. On a small peninsula of rugged hills and hidden coves called Gallipoli, the Allies, in a bold plan championed by Winston Churchill, attempted to force the Dardanelles, capture Istanbul, and knock the empire out of the war. They landed a massive force of British, Australian, and New Zealand troops, the famed ANZACs. But they were met by a ferocious, unyielding defense, led by a quiet, determined officer who seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying his men, anticipating every move, and holding the line when all seemed lost. His name was Mustafa Kemal. For nearly a year, the battle raged, a horrific stalemate of trench warfare. But the Ottoman soldier, defending his homeland, would not be broken. The Allied invasion was a bloody failure, and they were forced to withdraw in humiliation. Gallipoli was a stunning victory, a moment of profound national pride that proved the Turkish soldier was still second to none. But it was a victory that only delayed the inevitable. The empire was bleeding from 1,000 cuts, and by the autumn of 1918, it was utterly exhausted, its armies shattered, its people starving. On October 30th, 1918, Ottoman delegates signed the Armistice of Mudros aboard a British battleship. The war was over. The guns fell silent. But the silence was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of the executioner sharpening his blade. The victorious Allied powers moved in, not to rebuild, but to dismember. Their warships steamed through the Dardanelles and anchored in the Golden Horn, their guns aimed at the Sultan's palace. British, French, and Italian troops occupied the capital and began carving up the Turkish heartland of Anatolia itself. The Sultan, a powerless puppet, was prepared to accept any terms to preserve his throne. It seemed that this was the end, the final, humiliating extinction of a 600-year-old story. But from the ashes of the empire, a new fire was kindled. The hero of Gallipoli, Mustafa Kemal, refused to accept this final degradation. He slipped out of occupied Istanbul and traveled to the bleak plains of central Anatolia, where he began to forge a new army from the remnants of the old, and a new idea from the ruins of the past. This was not a fight to save the multicultural Ottoman Empire, or the House of Osman, or the Caliphate. That world was dead. This was a fight to save the Turkish nation itself, to forge a new, independent, and sovereign homeland from what remained. This was the Turkish War of Independence. For 3 years, Kemal's nationalist forces fought a seemingly impossible war on multiple fronts, driving out the occupying powers one by one. And when the last foreign soldier had been expelled, he turned his attention to the ancient institutions that he believed had led his people to this ruin. In 1922, the Grand National Assembly, under his direction, voted to abolish the Ottoman Sultanate. After 623 years, the reign of the House of Osman had come to an unceremonious end. The last Sultan, Mehmed VI, fled into exile aboard a British warship, a final, pathetic ghost of a once great dynasty. 2 years later, in 1924, the Caliphate itself, the spiritual leadership of the Sunni Muslim world that the Ottomans had held for 4 centuries, was also abolished. The last link to the imperial past was severed. What was born from the ashes was something new: the Republic of Turkey, a modern, secular nation-state. The question that had haunted the last 2 centuries of the empire's life, how to survive in a modern world, had finally been answered. The answer was to let the empire die so that the nation might live. The decline of the Ottoman Empire was not a single event, but a long, agonizing unraveling, a slow death by 1,000 causes: internal decay, external pressure, the poison of nationalism, and a series of fatal choices. It was a suicide and a murder, committed on the grand stage of history, and its fall left behind not a void, but a world of ghosts, of new nations and contested borders, whose bitter legacies continue to shape our own time. The sun had finally set on the empire of the sultans, leaving behind a twilight world forever haunted by the memory of its golden afternoon.